Now, ladies and gentlemen, we turn our attention to vibrancy and how we can work together to provide places and not just building sites. We absolutely have a combined responsibility to house our citizens in neighbourhoods and communities. We absolutely have a combined responsibility to create opportunities for jobs. We absolutely have the combined responsibility to connect our regions and our cities. But let's make them vibrant neighbourhoods. Let's make them great jobs. Let's create smooth connections. Building cities is not just about a building site, it's about building place and community. And naturally, alongside those dwellings, factories, offices, transport hubs, we also need things to do. Things to excite the senses, things to nourish the soul. This means art and sport, culture and tourism, an early morning brunch culture, as well as a nighttime economy. We're about to hear from the person who's charged with safely connecting Greater Western Sydney. He's going to facilitate the creation of the future jobs of Greater Western Sydney. He's going to help spark the cultural and social fabric of a region. We'll hear from the Minister now and then, once again, set up our imaginary fireplace on the stage for he and Adam to nut out how we're actually going to achieve these ambitions. So, with that, I encourage you to put your hands together and welcome to the stage the Minister who has the best portfolio in the government, the Honourable John Graham, MLC, New South Wales Minister for Roads, Jobs, Tourism, Arts, Music and the Nighttime Economy. Welcome, Minister Graham.
Thanks so much, Brett, and thanks to Adam and to Chris for having me here today. I want to thank you and your team for putting on this event here at Accor Stadium. Now, I think Coldplay, Taylor Swift, these were amazing support acts, but I'm glad we're finally here for the main event, the Boomtown Property and Infrastructure Summit. Welcome. I'd of course like to begin by recognising the Wongal clan of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Every year as Sydney grows, the centre of gravity for our city shifts westwards. And with that, so do the opportunities, but also the challenges, given that we're playing catch up on so much of our important infrastructure. And that's the physical infrastructure, that's the roads, the schools, the utilities, but also the cultural infrastructure, performance spaces, arts institutions and tourism. The key point that I really wanted to make today was that the opportunities are building here in Western Sydney and we just have to rise to meet them. And the opening of the Western Sydney International Airport is, of course, as many of you have advocated, the classic example of that challenge. You know the figures. By 2031, the second airport is expected to generate 28,000 direct and indirect jobs, and the wider Western Sydney Aerotropolis precinct could eventually employ as many as 200,000 people. It will be a major boost for freight. It'll send millions of passengers out into Western Sydney's dynamic restaurants. It'll send millions of passengers into our tourism sector, here locally, over the Blue Mountains and down into the Illawarra. But we won't meet that opportunity without the infrastructure to match. And when we came to office now over 18 months ago, we were very concerned that the airport could be ready before the roads infrastructure in particular would be. That's why very early on we made a call that the Northern Beaches link was not the most important piece of infrastructure to build next. The decision we made instead was to invest in Western Sydney and in particular into the road network to connect the airport to the community. Since that time, in the lead up to last year's budget, we announced $1 billion for the roads that will connect the new airport and the Bradfield City Centre. And that brings the program for Western Sydney roads to $5.2 billion over 4 years. That's a third of the roads budget in the state. That's in partnership with the Australian Government and includes key roads like Mamre Road, Elizabeth Drive, Richmond Road. That $5.2 billion budget over 4 years is almost double what the previous government spent on Western Sydney roads during their last 4 years in office. It really reflects the priorities of this incoming government. We also believe, and I know this will be a point of discussion over the day, that the roads of southwest Sydney require a similar approach. And the long-term planning for that has begun as part of Transport's Outer Southwest Integrated Transport Plan. In the tourism portfolio, we're faced with a very similar situation. As the recent look at the visitor economy strategy revealed, a boost in aviation capacity is really going to be the key driver of growth right across the state in the visitor economy over the next decade. Of course, Western Sydney Airport is at the heart of that. I'd particularly like to thank Chris for his involvement in consulting with the Visitor Economy Steering Review Committee and for his insight into tourism in Western Sydney. I know that the Western Sydney Leadership Dialogue and their discussion paper, How to Win the West, is pushing hard to see as much capacity at the airport as possible and to have that happen as fast as possible. And when it comes to boosting aviation capacity, we are very much aligned. What that look at the Visitor Economy Review showed was that if we can boost inbound seats by 8.5 million, we can boost our visitor economy in the state by 70% over the next 10 years. That produces a payday for the state's economy of tens of billions of dollars every year as we lift visitor expenditure from $53 billion, where it is this year, up to $91 billion a year. That is a huge opportunity for the state. But there are other constraints we need to fix too to be able to reach that opportunity. One of those is hotels. There's simply not enough hotels in Western Sydney and not enough in the pipeline. We believe, much like we've done with the government's housing agenda, we need some significant planning reform to get the hotel pipeline moving. It'd be such a shame if arrivals at Western Sydney Airport drive straight out of Western Sydney because there's nowhere to stay. It's the same challenge with skills. And on this, we're partnering with the federal government to change TAFE courses for future workers in the tourism industry. If we get this right, it could help take tourism jobs from 300,000, where they are at the moment, to 450,000 jobs over the next decade. Another reason that I'm passionate about getting the airport right is what it could mean for the 24-hour economy. We've been working very hard since our days in opposition to rebuild Sydney's nightlife after a decade of lockouts and lockdowns. So far, that work's been focused on removing outdated regulation focused around hospitality and entertainment industries. Now, I want to be very clear, I'm a Labor MP, I'm from the Labor movement, and I believe in active government. But sometimes the best thing that government can do is to actually get out of the way. So far, what we've done, some of the laws we've had to rip up along the way have been so ridiculous, you didn't really know whether to laugh or to cry. There were the bans on disco balls in a karaoke bar. There were the outdoor areas in pubs where you could sit but not stand when you had a drink. And in one of my favourites, there was a condition on a licence of a Dubbo tavern that only allowed, a law of the land in New South Wales, only allowed cover bands. Which meant you could play an AC/DC cover, but if Angus Young turned up and wanted to belt out Thunderstruck, he would have been breaking the law. These rules were making it so hard to do business that venues were going out of business. In a decade, we'd lost half our music venues. In the last 18 months, we've passed 2 tranches of legislation, cutting all that red tape. We're starting to see that deregulation pay off as venues are coming back. We've shifted the needle on noise complaints, and we're now starting to see more diverse venue offerings. And I mean both geographically diverse, but also different offerings from venues. That's particularly important in Western Sydney because we don't accept that Western Sydney is all the same. Each of these areas has got to develop their own character. One of the bright spots in our city's new nightlife is in Penrith, where for the first time a Penrith restaurant has been awarded a hat in the Good Food Guide. So congratulations to Sinclair's and also to Cricker, who've been awarded the first ever hat to a Windsor restaurant. So even the centre for gravity of restaurant hats is moving further westwards in Sydney. Also in Penrith, one of the bright spots, a great operator now who's started up 3 venues, Mr Watkins, a cafe by day, bar by night, Elton Chong, which is a dive bar, and thirdly, a great new bookshop. Penrith High Street is one of more than 40 areas where we've been supporting them with our Uptown program, backing local businesses to band together, making the changes they need to market their combined offering to the world. These are promising developments, but promising developments with tens of thousands of visitors only years away. So whether it's bars and restaurants that are banded and branded together in Camden Village, Little Asia in Cabramatta, Lunar Nights in Burwood, or the Inner West Ale Trail of breweries, we're supporting the local businesses who know what works best in their local community and in its subcultures. And that ability to tailor a nightlife to the local community in this diverse city is so important. No one wants to see the old King's Cross copy and pasted across Sydney. That's not how communities work. It's especially the case that it's not how Western Sydney works. Now that work is underway to rebuild a geographically and culturally diverse nighttime economy, we're expanding our focus to work towards a truly 24-hour economy. That involves broadening the focus beyond hospitality and entertainment to the entire nighttime economy workforce. To give you an idea of how big that is, that's over 870,000 workers in our state, 21% of the state's workforce working after dark. So you get some sense of how big the opportunity is here if we can meet the unmet demands of this workforce. And let's be clear about what those are. These workers have fewer transport options, fewer childcare options, reduced safety, less retail and food options. They often can't get a decent coffee to start their shift or a decent meal when they finish. Like we are with the entertainment precincts, we'll take a targeted precinct approach here as well. One of the biggest hubs of nighttime workers is the Liverpool Health and Academic Precinct. There's around 4,500 workers there, mostly in healthcare, which is the biggest employer in our state of nighttime workers. The other really big 24-hour worker hub, of course, will be the Western Sydney Airport, with a potential workforce of up to 200,000 people in aviation, tourism, freight, retail, catering and hospitality. There will be great economic opportunity here. But again, if we're going to meet it, the planning department have to get the planning right. We have to get the public transport right, the roads, the accommodation, the skills training, the regulations. All of those challenges are easier if we pick a few precincts to focus on and if we pick the right precincts to start. Finally, the backdrop to this, overarching all of this, is the government's housing agenda, which is simply about building more medium and high density housing near infrastructure and jobs. As the Premier's made very, very clear, for far too long, Sydney's housing plan was adding another row of houses to the edge of Western Sydney and then worrying about the infrastructure afterwards. That has been a failure. It's led to a divided city and a housing crisis that is pushing young families, people in their 30s, out of Sydney. The next generation of workers from Western Sydney shouldn't have to be driving to the other side of the city, spending large sums on tolls along the way and long hours away from their families. So if we look ahead a decade for Western Sydney, we want to see an airport that is thriving, creating tens of thousands of jobs and bringing millions of passengers, a visitor economy ready to receive travellers and offer them incredible, authentic experiences right here in Western Sydney, a network of 24-hour precincts serving locals and visitors and speaking the unique personality and needs of each community, a rebalancing of arts infrastructure so that people in the West have similar access to arts and culture as people in the East do. We want to see more affordable housing close to roads and transport infrastructure that connects locals to jobs, family and friends. All of that is possible. The opportunities are here in Western Sydney. I want to thank the Western Sydney Leadership Dialogue for the work you do in advocating for that future, along with all of you. Thank you for what you do. It's important work. Thanks for having me here.
Minister, thank you and welcome. Firstly, I'm pleased that you've read our federal advocacy document. I'm even more pleased that there's an alignment there on our aviation approach and opening up the airport so that it's best place to succeed from day one. We're obviously going to be having conversations with your federal counterparts over the coming months leading up to the election. What are some of the things that you'd like to see either us state or things that you're going to be stating yourself in terms of emphasising the importance and the role that that airport's going to play, particularly when it comes to the visitor economy?
Yeah, well, I think it is, the dialogue's been a key advocate right from the start on that, but the key thing as I look at the opportunity for the Western Sydney Airport is it's not an opportunity for Western Sydney, it's an opportunity for the state and the nation. It's at that scale and we've got to deal with it on that scale. I've met again this week with the airport and with the federal government to press the case that we want to see Western Sydney Airport start well and grow fast. That is absolutely essential. The dialogue's outlining a range of views about how that should happen, but we need to make sure that the opportunities are there, particularly in the first 3 years, to really make sure this goes well. If it does, that's hugely significant for the state.
Yeah. Was there a round of applause about the start there? Or no.
No.
There should be.
No, there wasn't.
There we go. You mentioned hotels, which is one that's starting to gather a bit more. I think we're starting to become a bit more in tune and aware of that shortage. Something that I think a lot of people in Western Sydney have known for a while now. You mentioned the reform and the focus from the state government on housing and how some of those ideas, incentives may be applied to grow assets in that sort of hospitality space in Western Sydney. How do you see that working?
When we did the visitor economy review, looking at what the strategy is, what it showed was if we're going to meet that goal, we need 40,000 more hotel rooms over that decade. That's a big challenge. Many of those need to be here in Western Sydney. That simply isn't possible with the planning system we've got operating in the way it does at the moment. So that is a confronting conclusion, but it's an inescapable conclusion. So the discussions we're having at a government end, we'd like to see a fraction of that effort and energy and the change that's gone into housing and planning to go into hotels and planning. If we do that, then we are a chance to meet this challenge, and it's very, very important that we do.
Yeah. You mentioned roads, and obviously thank you. There was a massive windfall and investment early in the year as part of the state budget, $5+ billion on Aerotropolis roads. And you flagged the work that's happening with transport now on the outer southwest, something that we've been quite vocal about. What do you see as the outside of the sort of housing imperative around needing to connect future residents? What are some of the other areas that are sort of pushing that importance, particularly around industrial precincts, employment lands, etc., especially in the southwest?
Yeah, well, we have made choices. We've made choices that have seen the roads infrastructure around Western Sydney nearly double. But they're choices that haven't been about favouring one area of the city over the other. It's really about where to get the biggest economic bang for your buck. And when the advice from Infrastructure New South Wales or Infrastructure Australia was really clear that the benefit to the state would come from investing here rather than, for example, the Northern Beaches link. So don't think this is about preferring one area of the city to another. This is about an economic view of where the opportunity is. We've got to continue that work. The southwest is one of those areas we want to apply that same analysis that we've done around the around the airport precinct to look at what's the right way to move through the planning and transport issues in the southwest. I think that'll be really helpful so that people know, councils know, developers know what's in store.
Yeah. We had the Federal Minister for Cities up here earlier. We've often referred to you as the unofficial New South Wales Minister for Cities. I know that's not technically correct, but you're the closest thing to it, I think, and given your large portfolio, I think it matches. You mentioned the words vibrancy, dynamic, interesting places. If we're being honest, there's probably only a handful of pockets in Western Sydney. You mentioned, places like, Sinclair's in Penrith, and obviously we've got Church Street in Parramatta and a few other places around that can sort of have a legitimate claim to being a 24-hour economy. What does Western Sydney need to do to get to that point where it can have a credible, vibrant 24-hour economy?
Yeah, if we're talking about Sydney as a 24-hour city, we've got to be honest about where we're starting from, and that is a city that rises early and often, frankly, goes to bed early. That's where we're starting from. But the opportunity to gently change that, that is not going to happen everywhere, nor should it. But the point is, it shouldn't be happening nowhere. It has to happen some of the time somewhere. And the way we're approaching that challenge is to look at the areas of the city that do work 24 hours and are neglected as a result. And it is Liverpool. It will be the Western Sydney Airport. It's places like the port precincts in Wollongong and in Newcastle. It's places like the Randwick Health District. These are places where people are turning up to work around the clock, and as a city, often as a government or as government agencies, we're ignoring their needs, but we're ignoring the economic opportunity that comes from really planning much better for the night as we do for the day. That's a dialogue we're keen to have in Sydney, but it's also a dialogue other cities are having around the world.
It is a pretty big cultural shift in terms of how we view and understand the 24-hour economy, moving away just from venues and hospitality, bars, restaurants, actually looking at where those nighttime workers are, which I think is particularly important in a place like Western Sydney, which is home, I think, to its biggest employer is in health. You mentioned Liverpool. We've also got Westmead, Campbelltown. We'll have Bankstown soon as well. Getting that awareness around those opportunities, obviously it's just come out as part of the review, but what are you looking to do as part of the deeper examination into those industries and those workers about addressing their needs and creating those places that can support them?
Yeah, well, this, when I say this, other cities are looking at this, this is an international public policy dialogue really between the great cities around the world, each saying, how can we do this better after dark? And it's a new area of public policy focus. We're keen to learn from those cities. In this case, that focus on nighttime workers is really driven by the UK discussion. It is the discussion that London in particular has been having. It's their particular focus. And they're asking a really practical set of questions. For about 1 in 5 workers, how do they move around? What do they do just before and after work? What do they need? How do we keep them safe? They're really important questions for our city as well.
Yeah. You've been on record a number of times talking about the need to rebalance cultural infrastructure. We've seen some movement, some great announcements. We've got the powerhouse coming, Riverside's on its way, upgrades to Campbelltown Arts Centre as well. How far do you think we've gone in terms of tipping back the scales? Obviously, it's weighted pretty heavily in one way. Not saying we'll get to 50-50, but in terms of parity, how far do you think we've gone? How far do you think we still need to go?
Look, I think it's started, but I think there's a long way to go, is the real answer. The way we're dealing with this is public investment into venues in Western Sydney. That's, places like finishing the job with Parramatta Powerhouse, and I want to acknowledge the role of the former government there, but key investments into the Riverside, into Blacktown, into Campbelltown, that'll see public venues. A range of the changes to regulation that are seeing private venues put music back on their stages are rolling out across Western Sydney, a place that had become, from a music point of view, and I say this as a music fan, almost a venue desert. That's starting to change now, but I do want to be upfront. This is just the start of the change. There's a long way to go.
Yeah. There's been a bit of discussion, and we've been close to it. Roxy Theatres, a passion project. For those that don't know, it's where Chris watched Star Wars in 1977. He's told that one a few times. There he is. Let us know what the current status of the business case into that deal, and where do you think it's headed?
Well, I don't know when the next Star Wars is due to come out, but we've done some really good work behind the scenes on the business case, just to look at, okay, what's the status of this? And now we're going to slowly start to work through the best way to tackle that issue. The opportunity, though, is so significant. I've stood with Joe Halen, with Paul Scully, right in the middle of where the Parramatta Metro will be, and you can see just how much it's going to change Parramatta, and there's the Roxy right beside it. So yes, it's a passion project, but it's a really important question when you look at how Parramatta will come together.
I think it's an iconic one, and one that Parramatta's already changing for the better, and that we all see the opportunity that presents. So we're 100% on board with that. One final one. We all know the current budget and the steady consolidatory position that the Treasurer and the Premier have taken. Does probably make it a little bit harder in these economic times to prosecute a case for some of that fun stuff when cost of living, housing crisis is still in play. How do you turn up to a cabinet meeting to put the case for more dollars when you know that there's probably a higher pecking order that sits above it?
Yeah, well, look, firstly, as a government, we're unapologetic about watching the purse strings. I think it's really important at the moment that we do that. We have to. That's in tune with the public mood, but it's the right decision economically. Secondly, though, look, the areas I'm dealing with, some of those aspects that are the more fun parts of government, they're also economically really significant, particularly for cities. And some of them need significant public support. Some of them, though, and I say this as a supporter of active government, aren't best delivered by government. And I think we've fallen into that trap a little bit too much of late. Government's good at a lot of things. Fun isn't always one of them. I say that as a lover of government, but we've actually got to create a regulatory environment, create a city where creativity is valued, people should be out and about having fun, being together with their community. Government's got a role to enable that. It doesn't always have to deliver it.
Minister Graham, thank you. Not only do you have one of the largest portfolios, but I think, as we heard today, it's arguably one of the most important, and it's not just the fun stuff, but it's also the economic sort of drivers that sit behind it. So thank you. Up next, I would like to call up Anna Powell from CBA to provide a short vote of thanks. Thank you, Minister.
Thanks so much.